Quite a lot of new findings for the Shadow Minion Necromancer. On Maxroll, we are going to be adding a bossing variant and also a Golem pit push variant that you can use to not only defeat the tormented Uber bosses extremely easy, but also to try and max out your pit clear. As always, you'll be able to read up on everything that has changed on the written Maxroll guide here under the build scaling and stat priorities section. You still have our stat priorities as well as all the breakpoints that you should try and hit, and all of the corresponding aspects and also all of the stuff that you need to try and masterwork on the gear. And when we go to the endgame and progression variants, you will now also see the aforementioned bossing variant with all the explanations on what you need to be changing, how the skill tree, how the Book of the Dead is going to change according to the new findings that we actually have discovered. And then the same goes for the Golem pit push variant, where you are going to be a little bit squishier than before because we are actually getting rid of Bone Storm for Army of the Dead, making us way less tanky, but giving us a way higher ceiling in terms of damage. It's very important to keep that in mind when you are going for your extremely high pit tier push, because Bone Storm gave you the option to run Shielding Storm, which is obviously not going to be possible as soon as you switch to Frenzied Dead. But again, you will have more damage. It's just super important to focus on dodging as much as you can, and on softcore you can try as often as you want until you get that juicy tier 120 or tier 100 clear, depending on if you play with Holy Bolts or without Holy Bolts. For the bossing variant, we are going with the Army of the Dead. We are also changing the Hardened Bones from the amulet away to the chest in this case, to make room for unyielding and better make use of the multiplier that we are getting. We are able to reduce the Army of the Dead cooldown tremendously through Abhorrent Decrepify and the use of the aphotic aspect that is going to trigger the Abhorrent Decrepify at an absurdly high rate, because there is currently a bug going on that basically makes it trigger on almost every attack, and therefore the Army of the Dead cooldown is going to tank drastically, and you will be able to have it up quite a lot during the fight. And as you can see, we don't play Corpse Tendrils because on a boss it's not really necessary. You might think we're losing the vulnerable, which is true. That's why we are using the cold mages. Not only are we getting more vulnerable in this case, but we're also making use of a little bit more stagger through the application of the cold mages. And we are using a two-handed sight with the big blighted aspect on here for 240% multiplier. I get a lot of questions, two-hand scythe, one-hand offhand. So the biggest difference here is you always kind of want to use a two-hander because you get this big boost of an additional 100% when you are applying an aspect to a two-hander. So that is usually always the better choice. But when you can't fit all of the aspects that your build needs to start going, then you are going to change over to a one-hander and an off-hander setup just to be able to fit in all of those aspects. In this case, I'm able to use everything that I need. Therefore, I can use the two-handed scythe. And another question, why scythe? You might think that the implicit is not really that useful, which is actually correct. But a two-handed sword, for example, would give you 35 critical strike damage, which sounds like a lot, but this is going to be added into your additive bucket that applies to your main source of damage, and that is usually way more than 1,000. So if you're adding 35 to 1,000, that's basically nothing in terms of raw DPS gain. The scythe has the nice advantage that it is a slower weapon, but therefore has higher average damage per hit. So if you sum up the damage per hit numbers, divide them by 2, you will get a higher number than if you would do the same on the sword, for example. Yes, the minions are taking into account the attacks per second of the weapon, but since we are focusing quite a lot on the golem activation, and that is gated behind a cooldown, and we don't really care about the attack speed for our main source of damage, then the average damage actually becomes way more valuable for the build itself than the little bit less of attack speed that you are gonna get with a two-handed scythe. And then for the Golem pit push variant, we are actually doing quite a lot of changes. Not only are we going back to the multiplier here for the Shadow Mages with the 3 multiplier increased damage for each active Shadow Mage, which is going to buff our main source of damage, which is the Golem active ability. So basically we're getting the Shadow Mages just to support the Golem activation damage, and everything else is still the same. The Reapers on the second upgrade are still bugged, so you still get the first upgrade if you use the second, so you basically get one for free. Obviously you would want to use that. And then for the biggest Hulk smashes of the Golem, we are going to use the second upgrade here of the Blood Golem, which is especially useful for the single target boss encounters that are basically the biggest problem that are currently in the game in the pit. Furthermore, we are obviously going to stack as much Golem damage on literally everything as possible, while also making use of critical strike damage. We are making use of ultimate cooldown reduction twice on the jewelry, and one time we also want to have Golem active cooldown reduction to get that cooldown a little bit lower. 10 seconds is extremely easy, but we also want to have Army of the Dead up fairly often, because we are also making use of unyielding on the amulet, not hardened bones anymore. You understand, we're sacrificing our defenses quite a lot to have that ceiling increase in terms of damage, which is our main problem in the pit. Basically, we need to fight against the time, and only damage will help you. Obviously, if you get hit, you will much easier die. So if you are playing on hardcore, please do not do this. I have a hardcore version that you can get on my Twitch chat, and I will also link it down in the description below. If you are hardcore, well, maybe at the end of your journey you can use this. I will definitely do so myself at the end of the Maxroll pit leaderboard, just to see how far I can actually push and try to dodge everything, and at some point the character is going to die, but we will have had quite a lot of fun along the way. Then standard stuff, we also want to have the Aphotic, which is going to reduce the cooldown not only of your Army of the Dead, but also your Golem, which is arguably most important, through Abhorrent Decrepify, through the bug that I mentioned earlier. And the same thing again with the two-handed scythe and the higher average damage. If you want to see how why a scythe, you should skip back to the bossing variant where I explain this in detail, and yeah, listen to me ramble for 30 seconds, and then you understand why a two-hander when you use a one-hander in an offhand, and why a scythe is actually good for the Golem activation. And yeah, the skill tree changes just a little bit. I suggest you check it out in the planner, or if you want the written version, don't forget about this, because we also have the skill tree right here where I explain a little bit more. And you will also have to change the Paragon board just a little bit by changing the glyph right here. This has been Scourge before. We're changing this to Corporeal so that we are able to support our Golem much more. This is literally the only change that you need to do. While you might think that minion builds are basically brain AFK button mashing, you can actually go pretty high with the minion builds if you keep track of your blighted stacks on your bar. You need to play around the blighted aspect that you usually have on your two-hander or on your necklace, for example. I currently have this here on my one-hander, doesn't matter. You want to play around your 120% damage multiplier as best as you can. And for this, you need to keep track of the blighted stacks that you can actually see right here at my mouse. As you can see right here, I don't have any right now, and they stack up immensely quick. Right now, I have 6 seconds of 120% damage multiplier that I need to burst as much as possible. And for this, you might think, oh wow, okay, obviously I'm going to activate my frenzied my Army of the Dead, and therefore also my unyielding commander, which I currently don't have on the gear. But don't look at the numbers right now. This is just about the rotation. And obviously during the uptime, you want to slam as many Golem activations as possible into the blighted stack application. So right now I don't want to do anything. Right now I want to do as much damage as possible, and right now I'm actually saving up if I need to and if I have the option to do so. The Photic is going to help you quite a lot when you stack up the blighted stacks, because your skeletal warriors are now gonna deal shadow damage, which is in turn going to trigger shadow blight, which is in turn going to trigger blighted. So this right here is your biggest friend when it comes to dealing a lot of damage. Now, obviously, you don't only want to press your friend's Army of the Dead, which triggers your Unyielding, but you also want to press the Golem as often as possible during the uptime. But on top of that, you also want to activate all of the other multipliers during that blighted uptime. So all of our multipliers are first and foremost the vulnerable from Grasping Veins. You can see this with this slight blue fade or slight blue color around your target. This needs to be active before you press your Golem, or ideally permanently active, because also the cooldown of Corpse Tendrils is going to be reduced quite heavily with Abhorrent Decrepify. We can see this here. I'm going to do Abhorrent Decrepify, and now when I press the Corpse Tendrils right here, you can see the cooldown ticking down fairly quickly. All of the lucky hits reducing the cooldowns as much as possible. And while you are not in your blighted window, you can basically mash the keys as much as you like. But as you can see here, I do have 4 out of 5 stacks of our Flesh Eater, which is actually one of the most important sources of damage, because it's a 40 multi that obviously increases the already active blighted multiplier by quite a lot. Ideally, you want to time everything around your blighted stack. So obviously, when you're getting close to activating your blighted with 10 stacks, you want to press Consume Corpse to have the Flesh Eater active during the time of your blighted. This was pretty well done. On top of that, you also want to have your Skeletal Priest buff active, because that's another 30 multiplier. And in this way, this is actually looking like we are mashing buttons in very high pit levels, but the only thing we actually do is playing around our blighted stacks. So obviously I try to wait a little bit with all my damage, and especially with the consuming of the corpses, to have the blighted stacks up as much as possible. Obviously, on a lot of targets, you stack up the blighted super fast, which is not really a real scenario. But if we go back to the single boss training dummy, for example, you can see that it's going to be much more important to play around the blighted stacks here. I'm gonna hold the Golem because I'm press it when the blighted stack is up. Meanwhile, I keep track of my vulnerable through the Corpse Tendrils, and I also press the Raised Skeleton all of the time. I see the blighted, I press the Frenzy, the Army of the Dead, and I press as many Golems as possible. Now I stack up my Flesh Eater again, 3, 4, 5. I have it active at the exact same time of the Shadow Blight. I press as many Golem activations as possible. There you go. You see 3 stacks, 4 stacks, 5 stacks. I match my Flesh Eater. I see the Shadow Blight active. I press the last Flesh Eater activation there and try to sum this up. For Flesh Eater, I'm waiting for Blighted to hit 10. Boom, activating, spamming all the abilities. In the meantime, when you don't record a video and you don't have to speak out loud what you're thinking, you should definitely use your Golems outside of the Blighted application, but you shouldn't press it just before it becomes active, so you can slam as many Golem activations in your Blighted rotation as possible. 1, and we see how many we can get more. 2, and maybe if you get lucky, you can even get 3. I hope this is fairly understandable and you can make use of this. Maybe review what I'm doing a little bit better right here. Maybe watch this 2 or 3 times to really see how I'm timing the Flesh Eater stacks that is currently at 4 with the activation of the Blighted. As you can see, currently you would be waiting 7 stacks, 8 stacks. Now I can already Corpse Tendrils. Boom, boom, there we go. Everything is active and my Golem is gonna be blasting, right? As many Golem activations, and now you wait a little bit. In the meantime, you're preparing your Flesh Eater. Boom, Blighted is active, Flesh Eater is active. Get the vulnerable, get the ultimate, get everything active during and revolving around your Blighted uptime. Prepare the Flesh Eater as perfect as possible to your Blighted uptime. This definitely needs a little bit of training and practice, but it's not really a tough thing to do. But obviously, in Kyovashard right here, you can practice this. Right here, Kyovashard, the training grounds. You can practice this without any interference of any boss. This is obviously much harder if you have to do this same thing while you are also dodging boss abilities. And as I said before, I'm also going to try out this very build that is extremely squishy in hardcore at the end of the weekend, so that we can see how far I can actually go by not getting hit as much, but I obviously will have the benefit of having way more damage. Right now, I am just farming 81s with Holy Bolts on my Necro to get to 12 out of 12 masterworking, and then we're going to make the push at the end of the weekend to see how far I can actually climb in the hardcore leaderboard. You can see the pit leaderboard down in the description below, or on Maxroll in the events tab, where we actually have some prizes that you can win, and there's also some randomly raffled battle passes that Blizzard has given us to distribute. So if you're interested in that, definitely check that out. And if you like content similar to this, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time.